It's even used in the production of pharmaceuticals. And in agriculture, we use industrial size methods for fermentation. So we might be familiar with how bread is formed, and yeast is one of the main ingredients in bread. And the reason we used yeast is because it can metabolize sugars, and under anaerobic conditions, it'll produce carbon dioxide and ethanol. The carbon dioxide helps the bread rise, and the ethanol is just a regular byproduct of the biology of the yeast. But the ethanol is usually evaporated off, so we don't ever have to consume that. Cheese is another example, but if you'll notice, a different organism is responsible for fermentation in that pathway. Because the sugar we're metabolizing and the end product we get are the products of a different type of bacteria, a different type of organism and pathway. We see that in bread we use yeast and sugar to produce this carbon dioxide and ethanol. And in bacteria, in cheese we're using bacteria to do a very similar process. So this is showing you that two different pathways of fermentation exist. One that gives us ethanol at the end, and one that gives us lactic acid at the end. These are the differences between the two types. So we've seen that ethanol can evaporate off our food when we're cooking. If you cook with wine or something, your wine doesn't usually end up in the food. It usually gets evaporated off. That's why you don't necessarily feel it when you are cooking with wine and you eat something that's been made with wine. You don't feel that ethanol. But in beer, you do consume that ethanol. So sometimes in our products, what those yeast are making, we are consuming everything of it. Coffee, the point of fermentation is different. We use that to get this film off the outside of the beans themselves. So it's not always to make some sort of product, but just to digest or process some of our food. So when I mentioned that we can make energy products out of the fermentation process, we're talking about gasoline for our car, or the ethanol that is in the gasoline, in some forms of it, methane gas, forms of biomasses. Even in veterinary practices, we're using fermentation to produce vaccinations. Fermentation happens when composting occurs, when we're making pesticides. Sorry about that. Everybody get that? Yep. Make sure everybody has these. We're good. They're used in pharmaceuticals. I'm not exactly sure of the specifics in this, but I do know that some steroids, for instance, are metabolized through fermentation processes to make different compounds that can be put into drugs that have different overall goals. And what this means by diagnostic agents, this down in the bottom left is a type of kit that you buy to do some sort of experiment. You'll see if you go to any research lab, you'll see boxes of these because usually, often scientists don't make their own reagents, but they order them from a company, and they might use fermenting processes to make these chemicals. So we've seen a little bit about how bacteria and yeast and animal cells get their energy. We've seen that through aerobic and anaerobic forms of energy. But one of the big questions is how plants get fuel for their needs, how they get the energy and ATP required for their processes that they need to drive. And the answer is photosynthesis. And that's just the conversion of light energy from the sun to chemical energy. We've seen that energy isn't just created. If we go back to the last lecture and we think about the first law of thermodynamics, we can convert forms of energy to other forms, but it doesn't just come out of nowhere. We have to have a way to make it. So plants have an interesting adaptation. Plants, among other organisms, plants aren't the only ones, just the most famous for photosynthesis, but they have an adaptation to harvest energy from the sun and convert it directly into sugars, or convert it into energy in the form of sugars. So when we think about anabolic processes, these are those processes that are requiring energy to build molecules that we can use later. That's opposed to catabolism, where we're breaking down molecules to yield energy from them. And it's anabolism and catabolism that contribute to the overall metabolism of the organism. Photosynthesis is occurring in the chloroplast of cells. So this is important because the reactions required for this process are localized to specific organelles. And what does the net reaction look like? We're taking carbon dioxide and water at the beginning. A series of reactions are going to happen in different parts of the plant on different large proteins of the plant. And at the end, we're yielding carbohydrates and oxygen. So when we say carbohydrates, what do you guys think we're talking about here? Any ideas? Carbohydrates are a very large family of molecules, but the types we're making in plants are special. We've seen it a number of times in the other pathways. The answer is glucose. That is the carbohydrate we're making. Glucose itself is a type of carbohydrate. So are all sugars. And the oxygen that we're producing is eventually released in the atmosphere, and that's what we're breathing. This is the process that supposedly put oxygen on Earth in the first place. So here's a picture of the chloroplast. We can see stacks of membranes inside the chloroplast. We can see light is coming in. And the green is what we see, but other colors in the spectrum are absorbed. So I'll show you guys a cool video about how they first kind of discovered photosynthesis. And evidence that led people to think that plants could actually do something to change the gas that's around them, or change the air that's around them. So plants essentially take up carbon dioxide and at the end of the pathway give out oxygen, and that changed the atmosphere of the planet, this exact process. And it also was evidence for a reaction that was happening inside of the yeast. I hope this sounded